the second law. It means that the law is given anew to the people. They've already heard these things. It's amazing how God repeats in the Bible. I've read that before. Why do I need to hear that again? But God needs to repeat and repeat and repeat. And Deuteronomy is the repetition of the law. Because already, even in the very beginning of their history, even though they had received the law not long ago, I mean just a few years ago, and they're ready to enter the land, they're already beginning to forget. They're forgetting. They don't need to wait until they have Alzheimer's to forget, you know. As soon as they've heard it, it's already forgotten. It's kind of like kind of thing, you know. So God repeats. And Deuteronomy is God repeating what he said before, but maybe with a little more emphasis. Say, be careful. You need to remember. Please don't forget. Don't forget. That's something we need to learn. So, these are the things that God doesn't want people to forget. Not the bad things, but the good things that God has done, because that's where we go wrong. We might forget that we've suffered, that we've gone through pain, and we've hurt. We might forget that. But if we forget that God has blessed us, what he's done for us, if we forget Jesus Christ, then we're really going to be lost. We're really going to go astray when we forget that. Deuteronomy 29, these are the words of the covenant which the Lord commanded Moses to make with the people of Israel in the land of Moab, besides the covenant which he had made with them at Horeb. And Moses summoned all of Israel and said to them, you have seen all that the Lord did before your eyes in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all of his servants and to all his land. The great trials which your eyes saw. He insists on that. You saw these things. You saw what God, the amazing things that God did to Pharaoh. The power of God was displayed in such an incredible way that never, the great trials which your eyes saw, the signs and these great wonders. But to this day, the Lord has not given you a mind to understand, or eyes to see, or ears to hear. This is something I want to talk about. You still don't hear, and you still don't see. You're still blind, and you're still deaf. I have led you 40 years in the wilderness. Your clothes have not worn out upon you, and your sandals have not worn off your feet. You have not eaten bread, and you have not drunk wine or strong drink, that you may know that I am the Lord, or your God. And he even says, I can continue actually in verse 7, when you came to this place, Sihon the king of Heshbon and Og the king of Bashan came out against us to battle, but we defeated them. Especially, I think it's very fascinating to me when he says that you had sandals for 40 years in the desert. See, these words are told to the people at the end of those 40 years. They've gone through those 40 years. This is a generation that's gone really old of those that came out of Egypt. And speaking to the young generations that will enter the land. But you had sandals, and you didn't wear out. And he says, you didn't make wine in the desert. Of course, you know, it's hard to grow grapes in the desert of Sinai, you know, and to make wine. But how did you drink? How did you survive? And he says you didn't make bread. They didn't have bakeries and places to heat the bread and make it. So how did they eat? How did they make their clothes, even, he says, last 40 years? That's how good God has been with them. But he says, God has not given you ears to hear and eyes to see. That idea that we've looked at actually in our Bible study in Isaiah chapter 6, when Isaiah the prophet is called by God, God lets him know, he says, you know, they will hear, but they will not listen. You know, and they will not see. They will be blind to what they see. And Jesus takes these words of Isaiah again himself and says the same thing in his day. You have eyes to see, but you don't see. You have ears to hear, but you don't hear. What is this all talking about? That's what I'd like to talk with you about this morning. Especially these verses, these words. Where he says in verse 4, I can find it. To this day the Lord has not given you a mind to understand, or eyes to see, ears to hear. Deuteronomy 29:4. They could have understood, they could have seen, they could have heard. The law had been given to them, and they could remember it. It's not that God willingly was blocking their mind or willingly was blinding their eyes. That's not the point. God did everything. Look at that. When he says he did amazing things in Egypt. I mean, you would have to be blind not to see the Red Sea being open, you know. You would have to be blind not to see the manna coming every morning for 40 years. God did everything he needed to do. But even despite the fact that God did all these things in our lives, they're still not ready to understand. They're still not listening to God, and they're still not discerning what he's done in their life. And that's the tragedy that we need to avoid and talk about. Like I said, Isaiah uses almost the same words. In Isaiah chapter 6, verse 9 and 10, when God calls Isaiah, he says, yes, they have eyes, but they will not see. They will be hardened. They will not listen to you, despite the fact of everything that I've done for them. And this example of Israel, this is not about the Jews. I think this is about all of us. Because even in the gospel that is found. In fact, even in the book of Acts that is quoted in Acts chapter 28. Paul is speaking, and he says the same words. You have eyes, but you don't see. You have ears, but you don't hear. Israel is taken as a model, as an example of how we should be careful. If we look at Hebrews, the book of Hebrews especially, I'll just read in Hebrews chapter 3. Here the prophet, the writer, says the same thing. He says, today, when you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts, as in the rebellion in the wilderness, the day of testing, when your father was put to the test and saw my works for 40 years. Therefore I was provoked with that generation. They always go astray in their heart. They have not known my ways. They shall not enter into my rest, into the promised land. This is something to think about. That it's possible for God to actually be extremely active in our life. It's possible for God to do amazing things in our lives, but for us not to see it. And to be blind to that. It's possible for God to be speaking constantly to us, trying to show us something in our life that's wrong. It's possible for God to be telling us for years, you need to deal with that problem. You need to obey me in this area, or that area. You need to come and commit your life to Christ, and for us not to even give one thought to it. That's the whole point of what I'm talking about this morning, what this passage they're talking about in these passages. Is it possible that God has done things in our life? Let's take practical examples. Is it possible that if we look back at our lives, let's say if I look back 5 years ago, and I think, wow, 5 years ago I was so bitter. I was like a viper, you know. I would say bad stuff, you know, about this person, that person. And when I look now, all that is gone. I don't do that anymore. Well, how is that? How did that happen? By chance? Is it because I'm such a great fellow, you know, or is it not something that God has done? Should we not attribute that to the Lord having worked in our life? But we've forgotten where we came from. We've forgotten how we were back then. Is it possible that we had a specific, particular sin that we were dealing with maybe 2 years ago? And now today, it's not a problem anymore. We don't even think about that stuff anymore. Well, isn't that wonderful? But what a tragedy if we forget how God has brought us from that point to this point, and to forget what God has been doing in our life. That's exactly what this is talking about here, what this passage. Look at Deuteronomy 32, 9 and 12. You know, we should never point the finger to the Jews and say, oh, well, look how they are, and look what they did. Because you can read the Old Testament and you have that same story in the New Testament. Everything that they went through, every mistake they made, we make the same and even worse. That's why Paul says in Romans chapter 10, 11, hey, you Gentiles, don't boast over the Israelites.